The first barrel didn't look like much when the hunter brushed snow off the metal rim. It sat half-buried beneath a stand of pines in Bear Brook State Park, the kind of forgotten refuse people passed without a second thought. But the moment he nudged it with his boot, the smell that escaped had a weight to it, heavy, unmistakable, and wrong. When he backed away and called authorities, he didn't know he had just uncovered the opening chapter of a mystery that would take decades to unravel, one that stretched across states and identities and families who never even knew their loved ones were missing. Investigators arrived fast, fighting cold hands and the fading winter light as they pried the lid free. Inside lay the remains of two people. One was an adult woman, wrapped in plastic. The other, a young girl, not more than 10. Their bones showed no obvious cause of death, but both had been there for years, sealed inside the barrel and hidden only a few yards from a park trail. No missing persons report matched them. No one in Allenstown recognized them. They were simply two bodies with no names, found together in a place that should have been safe. Police canvassed nearby homes, including Bear Brook Village, a small cluster of trailers and transient residents living a short walk from where the barrel had been discovered. People remembered faces from seasonal workers, drifters, and families who came and went with little trace. The village had always been the kind of place where people stayed for a month or a season, paid cash, and left without forwarding addresses. Detectives tracked down former residents, landlords, and anyone who might recall a mother and child who vanished without a sound. Tips surfaced, then went nowhere. The woman and the child were buried as unidentified victims. The case stalled, and the barrel faded into local memory. 15 years passed before anyone looked again at that patch of woods, for a reason that had nothing to do with the original crime. In the spring of 2000, a state trooper investigating an unrelated matter walked the same trail and noticed a second barrel tucked deeper among the trees. It was identical to the first, same color, same industrial style, same age. Inside were the remains of two more girls. They were younger than the first child, both small, both murdered, and left the same way. The shock hit Allenstown hard. Investigators now believed they weren't looking at one victim and her child. They were looking at 4 victims tied to the same killer. All 4 had died in the same rough window of time. All had been stored, transported, and abandoned in the same forest. And no one could account for any of them. Detectives now had to accept that the killer had returned to the same spot twice, confident enough to use the same hiding place again. Forensic testing in 2000 offered something the earlier investigators never had: DNA. The results pulled the victims' relationships into focus. The adult woman from the first barrel was the mother of the oldest child. The 2 younger girls in the second barrel were sisters. None of the 3 children were related to each other. All 3 had different fathers. And none shared DNA with any known missing person nationwide. It was as if they had lived their lives on the edges of society, unrecorded and unmissed, until someone ended those lives and hid the evidence in the woods. Police circled back to Bear Brook Village. They looked for anyone who had worked or lived there in the early 80s. One name stood out: a man who had used several aliases, including one that would eventually become infamous. He had arrived with a young girl he claimed was his daughter. People remembered him as a handy worker who fixed roofs, cut wood, and kept to himself. He moved frequently, disappeared without explanation, and never seemed to have roots. His real name was later confirmed as Terry Rasmussen. Years after the barrels were found, Rasmussen surfaced in California under yet another false identity. He was arrested for unrelated crimes, including the killing of a missing woman named Yoonsoon Jun. When investigators ran his DNA, it matched one of the Allenstown children. He was the biological father of the middle girl from the second barrel, the child who had never been identified and who had no connection to the adult woman found in the first barrel. That single match forced detectives to rethink everything. Rasmussen hadn't just passed through New Hampshire. He had lived in Bear Brook Village at the time the victims were killed. He had used multiple aliases, moved frequently, and formed quick relationships with single mothers who disappeared without explanation. Police suspected he had used the village as a temporary base, giving him access to the woods where the barrels were dumped. His pattern grew clearer. Isolate a mother and her children, gain their trust, then sever all ties before anyone realized they were gone. The adult woman in the first barrel was eventually identified as Marlace Honeychurch, a young mother from California who had last been seen in 1978 after a family dispute. The oldest child in the first barrel was her daughter, Marie. Both had vanished after being seen with Rasmussen. How they reached New Hampshire was still unclear, but investigators believed Rasmussen had traveled cross-country with them, then killed them once he isolated them from anyone who might come looking. The two youngest children remained unidentified for years. They were sisters, and one was Rasmussen's biological daughter, but the identity of their mother was still unknown. The family line dead-ended at Rasmussen. No missing persons report matched them. No relatives emerged to claim them. Genealogists spent years building family trees branch by branch, contacting distant cousins who had never heard of a missing child. The younger girl's mother was eventually traced to a woman believed to have been in a relationship with Rasmussen, a woman who has never been located and is presumed dead. Rasmussen died in prison in 2010, taking most of the truth with him. After his death, investigators deepened the search into his movements, his relationships, and his pattern of targeting vulnerable families. Forensic genealogy eventually identified the youngest girl's relatives, confirming her maternal lineage, but not solving the fate of her mother. What remained was a trail of abandoned identities and fragmented families, each leading back to the same man. By the 2000s, the case transformed into one of the first major uses of genetic genealogy to link unidentified victims to a serial offender. The barrels were no longer an isolated mystery. They were evidence of a broader pattern of predation spanning multiple states. Rasmussen had left bodies, aliases, children, and missing women scattered across decades. The Allenstown victims were only the crimes that had been discovered. Even with identifications made, two of the children's mothers remained unknown. Investigators believed Rasmussen formed temporary relationships with vulnerable women, isolated them, and eliminated them when they were no longer useful. The victims' identities were fractured because their lives had been fractured, moved between states, cut off from family, and hidden behind Rasmussen's false names. Today, the barrels sit at the center of a case that still draws attention for its complexity and the quiet horror behind it. 4 victims, linked by one man who manipulated families, used children as cover, and left almost no trace of his true identity. The forest at Bear Brook holds no more barrels, but the unanswered questions remain, scattered like the pieces of lives he destroyed. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.